Okay, welcome back. This is Professor Serrano-Correa, and this is lesson 2.10, 2.10, part 1. We're going to talk about auto layout and constraints to the parent view. And then we'll do a second part where we'll talk about constraints to siblings, size class, and stack view. So to get started, you'll create a new project, single view application. You'll give it a name. Call this one auto layout. And I'm going to save it to the folder that I save all of my files for this class. And then I'm going to click on main storyboard. I'm going to add a button, an object to my view controller. Remember to do that. You'll go to the object library. For this version, Xcode 10 is at the top right hand corner, and other versions you'll see it on the bottom right hand side of your screen. So I will click on that, and currently I'm on button, but if you don't have that, you can just type the object that you're looking for and it will quickly find it for you. You're going to add this to the middle of your screen, and then what we're going to do is we're going to look and see what happens when we add an object and then we view the object in either other size devices or other layouts. So for example, like if we have our phone, if we change the orientation, so right now I clicked on the bottom part of my screen, so this so you see it there, it just popped up. And what I want to do is I'm going to change my orientation. If I change my orientation to landscape and my button is no longer in the center, I'm going to change how much I see my zoom so that I'm able to see the entire screen here. So there's where my button went. Again, if I have this orientation in the center. Same thing's going to happen if I change it to other sizes, other types of devices. So let's see here. Make sure I go through all my different steps. So the next thing I want to do is I want to create a set of rules, or what we call constraints, to make this interface adaptive. So we want it to be able to adapt to any orientation or to any other devices, and the way we do that is by adding constraints. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to click on the align button, which is down here on the bottom right part of my screen. And I want to click on that while I've got the button clicked. So if I don't have the button clicked, I'm not going to get these options. And so what I want to do here is I wanted to find the relationship between the button to the parent view. This is the parent view, right? And what I want is I want the button to be aligned horizontally and vertically in the container, no matter what view I have, what orientation or device. So these are two constraints that I've chosen, and by doing that I've got to click the add two constraints, and then I'll see these blue lines that show up on my screen. This here tells me that I now have a constraint, and the constraint is that I will have my button always centered to the parent view. And so if I change orientation, my button's always going to be centered. Notice over here under view controller, you have view, you have safe area, we'll talk about that in a minute, but you have constraints. Constraints was just added, and if you click on it, these are the two constraints that I've added. So this constraint and that constraint. The other thing that I can do to look at my constraints is I can click on my object. That's not, it's going to be controller. Okay, so I'm going to click on my object, and I'm going to go over here to the size inspector. Looks like a little ruler on the top right hand side of your screen. And when I click on the size inspector down here, you'll see constraints. So I have 1, 2 constraints. And as I add them, you'll see that they get added here. So the next thing I'm going to look at is aligning. I'm going to add a size constraint. So another thing that happens when you change an orientation or device, like if you go from your iPhone to your iPad, is that your objects will need to adjust with the device. So do you want the objects to stay the same size from one device to another, or do you want it to fill the whole screen from one device to another? And so by adding a size constraint, we can do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a size constraint relative to the screen, and we're going to tell it how many pixels we want from the left hand side and the right hand side of our screen. So we'll click on the button, and then we'll go to the bottom again, right hand side, and we're going to, this time we're going to click on add new constraint. And when you click on that, you'll notice certain things. So here, this number up here is how many pixels down your button is from the top, and this one is from the bottom, and then you have the left and the right hand side. You have a width, so this is a size, the width and the height of your button. So right now what I'm going to do is I want the height of my button, no matter what happens, I want it to be 60. And I'm going to add that constraint. So it was at 30, so it's going to make it twice as tall as before. And actually, let me change the color of this so that you can see. I'm going to go to view. Excuse me, I'm going to my attributes, then go to view, then go to background, and I'm going to change the background to this color that I used recently just because it's there. And then, so now you can see what the button looks like. It's a bit taller, and no matter what device I use, my button is always going to be that size. It's not going to change the height of it. Now, what if I want my button to be a certain number of pixels from the left and the right of my screen, no matter the size of my screen or orientation? So right now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger. Just show you something here. Go to the center. So the constraint for centering has gone away. I've made some changes. So it's not longer working the way that I had it working earlier. So I'm going to take my button and I'm going to move it back to the center, and then I'm going to look at my constraints by looking at the size inspector, and now have it relative to the center of my screen. So it should, no, okay, let's go back to my constraints. Add those. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to fill the screen with my button. Let me make sure this is working first. Okay, so what I want is I want to add a constraint that I always want this button to be on the left, 20 pixels from the left, and it should be equal 20/20, but we'll do 20/30 so you can see the difference between those. And notice here it says 30 pixels from the right, and over here it is you'll see 20 over here in the top right. Right down here you'll see 30 and 20. So if I change my orientation, my button, notice it gets longer because I want it 20 and 30 pixels from the right and left. Same thing if I use, let's make this smaller. If I use the iPad, no matter what, it's going to be 20 and 30. So that's my constraint. The next constraint I want to look at is relative to the safe area. So the safe area, if I click on safe area, well, if I click on view, notice that there's this pink line that goes all the way around my device view. So the safe area is the area that doesn't, for this particular device, it doesn't include this top part and this bottom part here. Again, depending on the device, like if I choose this device, the safe area is just the part of the top where it displays my battery life and my time. So what I want is I don't want my whatever I add to my screen, I don't want it to be on top of the or under the time or under the battery life. So right now, hold on, let me change back to this device. So right now I'm going to just delete my button, and I'm going to go ahead and add another button. And I'll add this button here to the top right of my screen. So if I add the button to the top right of my screen, notice that it's right. So if I have the orientation landscape, then it looks okay. Portrait, it's under my time. If I choose an iPad, it's right there under the time. Landscape is also way too close. So what I want to do is I want the button, no matter what I do, to be to not ever be in that safe area. Okay. So again, I'm going to make this button pink and maybe a little bit bigger. And pink. And then when I have the button clicked, I'm going to click on constraints. And what I want is, I want the button to be, so right here, notice it says 6. I'm going to type in 0. And I'm going to click on add constraint. And we're going to look at safe area. So notice right now, this is where I'm at. So if I have constraint, let's say that I make that a 10 pixels from the top, then it moves it down a little bit. If I click on constraint to margins, if I check off that box, notice this changed to 34. Let's say I change it back to 0. Let's see what happens when I add that constraint. So what it did here is that it made it to where it's aligned to the safe area. So notice that there's this here, and I'm going to have to delete the other constraints so I don't get any errors. And so let me do that real quick. I have a ton of constraints that I need to delete. To delete my constraint, I can just press the delete key, so I click on it. And again, the way that I got here was by clicking on the ruler, which is the size inspector. And I'm just going to press delete, delete. So now when I change orientations, or whatever device, I'm always going to be under the safe area, right at that safe area. No matter what device I choose, I'm never going to be on top of the safe area. Okay, and remember that the way that I did that is by clicking on add new constraint, making sure that this is checked off, constraints to margins, and then I have 0 here at the top. So that is the constraint relative to the safe area. If you add constraints that for example, if I had a constraint here that says 0, right, to the, and then I add, I don't know, some other constraint that would not match or work with this constraint, I would get an error with my constraints. So let's see if we can make this. So I have this constraint that's not going to go away. So let's say that I add a constraint and I put let's see, I take this off and I put 0 there. It's not gonna let me add it. Maybe I'll change it to 1 and I add the constraint. So now if I click on this 1 here, this is an error. So it's saying that this constraint, I can't do these two constraints. So I got to delete one or the other for it to work. So I have top margin constraint and safe area, and they're not going to work. So I can either go to my size inspector again to click on the button to delete one of them, but the little red means that I have an error. So it doesn't matter if I delete the safe area one, the one that I had before, then it's still going to work. my error goes away. But I'm only going to be one, like now it's going to, let's see here. Okay, so I'm at top margin, so that's going to work. Safe area. Okay, so the red just means, this little red numbers just means that there's an error and your constraints are, can't think of the word right now. They are, they're conflicting, that's the word. So you have conflicting constraints. And in your reading, it actually has you create other constraints so that you can fix them. So I would go through this section that talks about constraints, issues, and go through that, complete it. Go through this section that talks about warnings and complete that section so you can see what the warnings look like. They're going to be yellow, and so that you can also create and fix warnings so you're aware of what some of the issues, some of the conflicts are that you could potentially create not meaning to. Okay, so part 2, I'm going to show you how to create the constraints between the siblings. And so what that means is that you have two objects on the screen. Remember that the objects are the sibling, this is the parent class, and these are the subclasses, or the objects are the subclasses, so they're the siblings. So if we create, for example, 2 buttons, those would be 2 siblings. And so what we want to do is create constraints between the 2 buttons or the siblings. And we'll do that in part 2.